Hello, good afternoon. My name is Eamon Leonard. I'll be the moderator for this contentious debate. First, just before I introduce our debaters, I'm just going to run through some house rules about how this format works in case you haven't seen a debate before in your life. So each side gets 6 minutes to argue their position. That'll be followed up with 5 minutes of questions from me, and then there'll be a closing session of 3 minutes for each side to combined make their closing arguments. And then at the end, I'll be looking for some feedback from you guys to see how they did. So, as PJ alluded to, this debate is around when a leap forward is a step too far. So on my left we have Monique Morrow. Monique is a former CTO of Cisco Systems, and she's an internationally sought after speaker, author, and visionary. Monique was one of the top 10 influential IT women in Europe in 2014, and I'm sure 2015 and 16 and 17. Monique has an MS in Telecommunications Management and an MBA. She speaks French, German, and is learning Mandarin. Doesn't say anything about English. I hope you speak English. So.
Advantage, Jim.
There you go.
On my right, we have Jim Hunter of Greenwave Systems. Jim is the Chief Scientist and Technology Evangelist of Greenwave. It's a software and services company that leverages the Internet of Things technologies to help clients deploy managed services. And prior to joining Greenwave, Jim led Motorola's mobility, a division at Google, architecture and strategy for driving the future of a smart, simple, connected home. Also a avid science fiction fan and working on...
And budding writer.
Budding writer.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so the clock, I think, has already started ticking. So, before we came out here, I flipped an imaginary coin in the air, and the person who is going to go first is Monique.
It is me. All right. Okay. Thank you. So I'm actually for setting a bit of boundaries here in terms of technology, and I'm looking at this notion of ethics and autonomous systems and augmented reality and statements and issues around the following. Number one is around serendipity and randomness. The issue is with the coming realm of AI and augmented reality, how can we evolve and harness and not eradicate the positive effects of serendipity? For example, what do we stand to lose when we code frictions out of our lives? It may cause discomfort, but also joy and growth. The second is physiological. What are the connections between the physical and the psychological, the body and the mind? And being in a completely mediated world, could we, for example, fool the mind in thinking and feeling as it did in the earlier stage of one's life with measurable and physiological effects? The third is cognitive as an issue. When an AI-based mixed reality system controls the senses, does it control the mind? What does the short and long-term effects and implications of giving one's senses to software? A VR system can radically affect, if you will, the mind and how our mind processes and synthesizes information, and ultimately the way we teach ourselves. The fourth is the notion of social notions and religion. What happens to cultural institutions in an AI world, enabled world of illusion, where geography is largely eliminated and tribe-like entities and identities could spring up spontaneously? And the notion of identity morphs from physical certainty to virtuality. Opting in and out will be central to the coming digital experiences. But what happens with the opposite when people choose to opt out in the real world in favor of illusion? And the fifth, most importantly, perhaps, is privacy. Who is watching whom? A mixed reality world, or a virtual world, or a technology world driven by intelligent systems would have to be observing behavior and sensing physical phenomenon continuously in order to provide individuals an appropriate content. Is that sensible trade-off a dance with the devil? Does the sensing possible with these technology allow for ways to level the playing field? If the AI-enabled world of the future is monetized, is monetized with personal data, then surveillance might be baked into the system itself. But the ethical issues we see today will only be amplified in an immersive environment. In the end, an immersive experience could dangerously erode society's distinction between what is real and what is not, and therefore what is permissible and what is not. Therefore, I am arguing for setting boundaries in what we are doing with technology. This is the debate between mass empowerment and mass destruction. And we should be able, as technologists, actually to educate our audience, to educate the consumers on how and what is the use of technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique. A little bit ahead of time there. Jim, your position.
Absolutely. Good morning. My name is Jim, and I get to share with you my passion. As Eamon said, I'm actually the chief scientist and the evangelist, so this is one of the few times I get to combine my passion of science and my passion of talking about science with you guys. So the first thing I want to say is I am an avid advocate of pushing boundaries. And I have a logical and an emotional argument about why it's actually our ethical responsibility to do this for mankind. So let's start by breaking something down. I'm not saying we break boundaries. When you break something, there's loss. I'm not suggesting anything like that. I'm suggesting that we do continue to push boundaries. And I think we owe it to humanity to do that. I think the reason that we do is because we have to look at humanity itself. So if we go back in time, we can see that about 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens emerged on the African continent and then moved throughout the rest of the world. About 12,000 years ago, we started to create communication and arts. 6,000 years ago, we started to create civilizations. And we've been the dominant species ever since. So you could argue that the adaptation that we have done actually makes us the dominant species. So the first argument is we want to remain the dominant species. So how did we become the dominant species, and how do we survive? Well, there's a scholar of Darwin that actually says that it's actually not the strongest that survives. It's not the smartest necessarily that survives, but it's those that are actually most able to adapt to their changing environment. And the key here is change. Malcolm Gladwell calls out those people who make changes. He calls them outliers. A lot of us at the show here, the people that gather and we talk about all kinds of everything from geopolitics to science, technology, and ethics, are outliers. We're the ones that actually push the boundaries and shape the way forward for mankind. In general, the masses actually adapt to that. So it's our responsibility to enable that continued adaptation to be remaining the dominant species. And it's the pushing the boundaries that has gotten us to where we are today. It's pushing the boundaries that have given us the ability to actually enjoy this experience that we call life. It's given us the ability to create tools and processes that communicate, enable us to communicate, enable us to connect, enable us to feed and clothe and entertain and travel and do everything that we do today. It's technology and advancements in technology that enables us to create and find and share experiences with our family and friends. You could argue that without technology advancements, we wouldn't be on this stage today. Without pushing boundaries, we wouldn't have been able to even get to New Orleans in the first place. And we definitely wouldn't be Facebook Live streaming to the world today without these advancements. So as we continue to push these boundaries, we do need to know what can be pushed, where the safety barriers are to what can be pushed, but I don't argue that we should limit the areas that we push. I'll give you some examples of some folks that have been outliers in the past. Let's just talk about the ones we know very clearly. Aristotle, Steve Jobs, Isaac Newton. Without these outliers, we wouldn't have logical thinking. We wouldn't have usability with regards to technology, and we wouldn't have the ability to even know where we were with regards to the Earth and the rest of the universe. Other technology advancements, not just on the outside, but inward, facing inward, were people like Edward Jenner and Alexander Fleming, Francis Crick and James Watson. They pushed the boundaries of understanding our inner workings so that we could have diseases for smallpox cured. We could cure smallpox. We could create penicillin, which is the basis of every antibiotic today, another reason we're standing here on this stage, and the discovery of DNA that led to the field of genetics. Pushing boundaries makes us who we are. In fact, there's more than just logic to consider in this conversation as well. There's the ethical responsibility. As I said, we have been a logical thinking dominant species for at least 12,000 years. So if you consider that every 20 years or so, a new generation is born, that means there's 300 to 600 generations that have come before us whose only job in life was to make their kids, their children's lives better than the generation that came before them. And who are we as a generation or as a couple of generations to say, you know what, we're done pushing the boundaries, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't push forward. There's a lot of examples, I gave a few here, but there's examples. Fire is one of my favorite examples because fire has done a lot of really bad things. We associate some of the worst things in the world with fire, but it also does really good things. It gives us the ability to evolve as a species, to adapt to these new environments, to live in new climates, to go to the moon, to do all of the things that we do is because of fire. And there were boundaries pushed to find that. So my opponent has a stage where she talks about the dangers. Absolutely agree. There are dangers in breaking the barriers, especially when we talk about technology and weaponization and genetics and human cloning and all the other dangers that are there. But the answer is not to stop pushing a boundary. It's to understand and to use the boundaries that we have in front of us to measure and to test and to see where we sit with regards to breaking that boundary. We need to always be aware the boundaries are not made to be broken. And finally, I think that outliers, like the folks here in this room, owe it to humanity to continue to push those boundaries, if for no other reason, to help us and our children remain the dominant species in this planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Monique, you had a bit of extra time, so if you want, I'll give you the opportunity to respond.
Sure.
Now, is that fair?
Well, she did finish up a bit quicker than you did, so.
I was optimizing my time and sharing the boundaries.
I'm adapting to it.
So let me just suggest here, having a boundaries is really, as technologists, asking the questions, and these are the ethical questions. This is about what humanity should be doing. You quoted some people, but I'll quote Albert Einstein. After the bomb, or paraphrase him, after the nuclear bomb had been launched, he absolutely said, at this point in time, what we have to think about is, where do we put governance in place? So there is the point of allowing, I think, the issue of progressing in terms of what technology, the benefits, this is the dialectic that we're both struggling with, the benefits of these technologies to our society. And we as technologists have to be responsible. This is the argument, responsible and absolutely be prescriptive about what is the intended use of a technology. Just as you have a pack of cigarettes that suggests that you may gain cancer, we have to be thinking about, posing this question. This technology was intended for such and such a use. And this is where I'm suggesting about thinking in terms of boundaries and specifically in ethics. If not, we have to also ask our question, at which point have we gone too far? At which point, when we think about the progression of technology for the benefit of society in terms of medicine, the examples that you have provided, to this notion of what could be used as mass destruction at any point in time. Yes, we always have been struggling with evil, and there are evil actors, and that's been since the history of mankind. But can we not ask ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, as outliers you are, but also as responsible people that you are, to start posing the questions now in terms of the ethical use of technology and what that can and look like for all of us?
I'll give you 60 seconds.
60 seconds.
60 seconds, go.
So actually, you make some very good points. I think that from the ethical conversation, we have to be careful about putting the brakes on too quickly. We have to be careful about the people that weigh into the conversation and their motives for weighing in, because technology can be halted for very wrong reasons because of the bad actors that you've identified. I think that it's interesting because you talk about the prescription of what something's used for. A great example, across time, there's been so many inventions and innovations of mankind that actually have found a second life, and a much more vibrant second life than they were originally intended. As you were saying this, and because we're in New Orleans, Viagra came to mind. It wasn't originally intended to be what it was, but it's also responsible for maybe some people in this room. So you can't necessarily know that what the outcome, even if you prescribe it and say this is what it's going to be used for, you don't know that's what it's going to be used for at the end of the day.
Okay.
That was 6.
Good argument.
Thank you. Viagra always wins in that argument.
Okay, so a question for you both, 60 seconds each. How high are the stakes?
The stakes are very, from the perspective that I stand, the stakes are very, very high. It's never too late to ask the questions. On the other hand, I think that, as you have made an excellent point yourself, Jim, it's not about stopping, but absolutely asking the questions. Because if we aren't, what do we wait for? Do we wait for something that could be disastrous? And there will always be that poignant level of disaster that we need to be cognizant of. Not to suggest for 1 minute that we stop the research that goes on. I have a friend who's a roboticist in Zurich, and he particularly doesn't care about the ethical use of what he does insofar as the theoretical knowledge that he gains. On the other hand, he's a Luddite when it comes to his home life, because perhaps he is aware of the dangers that are embedded. So the stakes are high. We need to ask ourselves the questions. At which point, we just want to ask ourselves the questions, at which point do we wait and not ask the questions? So my plea to you all is to be able to say or suggest that in terms of embedding ethics, ask the questions now. MIT Multimedia Labs' Patty Mays has actually put together a study in this space in terms of embedding ethics in technology, and I suggest that we start now rather than when it's too late.
How high are the stakes?
The stakes are extremely high. If we stop advancement, if we stop pushing boundaries, then we risk becoming less. We risk not taking the full potential that we have forward. Now, I agree with you when you say we should ask the questions now. But I would go further and say we should always ask the questions. Not just now, but we should continuously ask the questions. And if the answer is, oh, we've got to stop, then the questions become much more important. Why do we have to stop? What needs to be stopped? What are some alternatives to get us to the same place where we want to go? It really is about the target of where we want to do. I saw the conversation about Moonshot, and Moonshot was really interesting because the stakes are getting us to Mars. But the conversation really, for me, was valuable because it's all the offshoot technology and all the new discoveries that happen because going from point A to point B requires all these other things. And for me, if we said, oh, Mars is too far, that's a boundary we don't want to push, then all these other new things would never come about.
So we're a little bit ahead of time. What I might do is go off script, sorry Laura, and ask if anybody in the audience has a question that they want to pose to both. Right over here, first hand. Hold on a second. Sorry, sound guys. There might be a screech.
Jimmy Fallon, everybody.
Hi. My question is, how far is too far?
It's a great question. I don't think we know how far is too far. I think it's a balance between what we struggle here in this conversation is a balance between too far does that endanger, quote, unquote, humanity? Would that be too far? At which point would we know it is too far? And yes, we should be asking questions, but sometimes we're not asking those questions. That's actually being prescriptive here. It's why, for example, IEEE has a humanities series on this whole issue of ethics and technology. So how far is too far? It would be, at which point do we believe, and I think we believe as a mixed group of people, because if we're not a mixed group of people, we are an echo chamber of ourselves, where we are looking at where dangers can be and dangerous can be in a massive group of humanity. That's really my opinion there.
So I will actually use your quote from Einstein, which was not, once we exploded a nuclear weapon, the answer was still not, we put nuclear in the corner and forget about it. It was now we need governance over this. So too far is actually a really difficult conversation depending on the yin and the yang, the value that you actually get from the technology. If you look at nuclear as a great example, without nuclear we wouldn't have the option to go to Mars. We wouldn't have the ability to perform X-rays. We wouldn't have the ability to do a lot of the things we do until we split the atom. So Madame Curie died in her research, and that's actually an impact on human life, but it wasn't too far. In fact, it was in her honor that everything moved forward because they saw the value that was underneath it all. There are always going to be bad actors. There's always going to be misuse of technology, but it really is a balance, I think, between the good and the bad that you get from a given advancement and boundary.
So I do, sorry, I'm going to go in, but I do suggest that what's important is that society become involved in the conversation. And part and part of that is the educational aspects of it. The impacts of these sets of technology to us as humans and its benefits and understanding the risks. I think this is far more important because when we're talking about humanity and the benefits of humanity and the ethics involved, I think it's important to actually have that educational, if you will, exchange with society, and that's just beginning.
Okay, so we're tight in time, so 45 seconds, closing arguments. Jim.
So I think that first thing you guys should know is we actually had a hard time getting this debate together because we actually basically both agree in areas. So I've played a little bit of a bad actor in some things. I don't necessarily believe that we should push every single boundary out there. Yeah, here she comes. She's going to trump me. We've rehearsed this. Yeah, I feel intimidated. But in general, the whole purpose of this is to get everybody thinking, to get everybody asking questions, to get everybody kind of wondering how far is too far. That was the perfect question because there is challenges. There are technology dangers that we have ahead of us with AI, with drones, with weaponization. All these things are going to be challenging, and we have to have the right mindset and the open question mindset about what's going on.
Monique.
So I have the pleasure of listening to Kate Crawford in South by Southwest, who talked about the dark days ahead, the rise of AI and the rise of fascism. And what she talked about was the history of misuse of technology, and it took us on a journey to us and for us as human beings to be aware of the misuse of the technologies itself. If you think about, for example, the Hallwright tabulator machine. The Hallwright tabulator machine, which is part of IBM, by the way, was used by the Nazis in their census tabulation. That's an example of misuse. So I think we just need to be very, very cognizant of how we use technology and for what purpose, and now we have to involve our society as a whole. So asking those questions as technologists and engineers and as people who use them, what is its purpose, is an opportunity for us all.
Okay, thank you both. We're definitely out of time now, but you guys can see the audience pretty easily. We'd be interested in a show of hands of which side of the stage, if you were to come up, you'd be standing on. So if you were standing on Monique's side of the stage, could you put your hand in the air? Okay, and if you're standing on Jim's side of the stage, that's about a 50-50 split. Your hand doesn't count. Okay. Thank you very much, both of you. Please put your hands together for Monique Morrow and Jim from Greenway.